So here we are. And so I want to welcome you, Bob, to the conversation. Super amazing to have you. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with the broader design ops community.
Yeah, of course. Well, thank you very much, Allison, and thank you to everybody out there in TV land for spending part of your day with me. Here we are just in the final week or so before the end of the decade. So when Lou says it's the last call of the year, it's actually the last call of the decade. But we're not, the decade number does not catch in people quite as much as the year. So,
Hey,
Yeah.
Bob. Bob, I'm going to interrupt and just say, even though I've done 25 or 26 of these just for this community alone, it doesn't mean I'm still not prone to screwing up and forgetting to hit the record button. I forgot to hit the record button. I just hit it a minute ago, but
I saw it come on.
Everybody know we got Bob Baxley. That's the one we're doing today, in case we didn't cover his last name in the last. All right, I'll mute again.
All right. Well, Speaking of the decade, I think it's a good kind of segue to talk a little bit about, without going too much back in time. I think if everybody wants to know more deeply about Bob, they can search the internet. But I would love to know, if you could tell us a little bit about your, most recently what you've been up to. And I think essentially maybe like coming out of a little bit of retirement, quote unquote. Moving into a new role. So yeah, if you could just give us a little bit of a high level of what you've been up to for the last couple of years would be great to hear it.
Yeah. So, I left Apple back around 2014, I think it was, so about 6-7 years ago, and had a chance to go lead product design at Pinterest. So went and did that for about 1.5 years. It was a bit of a shell shock going from a big giant company like Apple to a smaller hyper growth startup like Pinterest, but had a great experience there, learned a ton, and then decided to kind of move on and look around at some other things. Turned out at that point, my kids were getting pretty close to the end of high school and going off to college, and it seemed like a good time to just sort of hang out and spend some time with them. I did end up spending quite a few years, actually. I think it was about 4 years, networking with a lot of people, speaking at some conferences, and really getting a much better handle on where the design community was and where the current thinking was. And having been in Apple for the preceding 8 years, I had been a little insulated from how much things had evolved in the larger design community. So the 4 years ended up being really interesting, and to hear kind of where the ideas were going. I also got really interested in trying to get high school students interested in design, because as all of you know, everywhere you go, you hear about the problem hiring designers. And I've come to believe that we just have kind of a top of the funnel problem. There's not nearly enough people going into the field because not that many people know it exists. And I ended up doing a couple of talks about that. And then I have lately been doing talks at high schools and junior highs. I've recently been added to the board of a nonprofit called Project Invent, which is really cool. I hope you guys will go check it out. Project Invent, they have a curriculum where they do kind of after school maker, innovator, tech incubator type programs for high school students. So, high school might have a team of say 10, 12 kids, be some combination of tech people, product managers and designers, and they create some sort of product that's labeled, technology for good, which tends to be medical devices. And so I've been coaching a couple of those teams and just gotten to interact with some of the teams. There's 30 different teams in the United States this year in high schools all over the country. And if you ever get a chance to go talk about what you do at a high school or even a junior high, I strongly encourage you to do so. Whether you're in design ops or design or anything in our field, I don't think people realize the tech field employs a lot of people that aren't engineers. And there's an awful lot of minds out there that can bring a lot to the table in these companies. And these companies they're all talking now about how much they need liberal arts majors. They need different types of cognitive backgrounds. And when you go to high schools and you see how practical most of the educations are and how much those kids feel like they're getting jammed into these STEM careers when it doesn't quite fit them, and they see somebody like you come and talk about all the different things that they could be doing, like it really, really opens up their world. And it's, frankly, it's an enormous relief to them. And if you go to the career centers, you'll see it's an enormous relief to their parents as well, because suddenly they realize that their sort of artistically oriented kid isn't necessarily going to be an art school dropout, right? There's a lot of other things they could do.
Yeah.
So that's sort of my plug for Project Invent, and just going out and talking to Gen Z. That's the generation started in 1996, and my kids are right in the beginning of that. So that's sort of how I got inspired to pay attention to them. But we need a lot more brains coming into the design field. So obviously that animated me a lot for the last few years. But then my kids got off to college, which is awesome, and things got a little quiet at home. And so I decided I wanted to go back in and try to apply some of these learnings into an actual corporate environment. And so about 2-3 months ago, I took a job with a company called ThoughtSpot, which is a Series E startup here in Silicon Valley that's doing data analytics. So we play kind of in the same space with Tableau and some other companies. And so I joined as Senior Vice President of Design and Experience. And we have a team, at this point, we have a team of about 12 people that we're hoping to at least double, if not triple, in the next 12 months or so.
Wow, that is.
Alison's taking notes.
Yeah. I love it. So much good stuff in there. So much good stuff in there. I love Project Invent. I've actually been talking with them as well about getting involved with their work. I love the things that they're doing and the things that they're thinking about. I think often about this problem of, getting design into places where, getting it out of ivory tower, essentially, and bringing it into like places with younger people so that they could actually see that this is a thing. If I talk to my father about what I do, he's like, I have no idea what you do, but you're making money, all good. But then when I was working at Frog, we partnered with the Girl Scouts and brought in a bunch of Girl Scouts in middle school, and we would bring them into the studio and we would talk to them. We would bring different people from different disciplines to kind of present to them and have conversations, and we would do this on a regular basis. And it was, to your point, incredibly fascinating to see their just like eyes light up, like, this is a thing, like, what, this office? And like, you're just like making stuff with your hands, or like it's all feels like
awesome.
space. Like, like everybody's telling me that they need more girls in STEM, but like I feel like I'm more connected to this, but that's not actually separate. So like, so I'd love to know how you're bringing this kind of thinking, now that you've had all that experience, into how you're approaching your new role, how you're thinking about growing your design team. If it sounds like you're going to be growing pretty, expansively over the next year or so, like, yeah, how are you thinking about actually applying all these things you've learned over the past couple of years?
So look, obviously it's early days here, and I haven't gotten wedded to any particular strategy, but when we look at hiring in particular, it's incredibly difficult to hire people in the Bay Area. It's really, really difficult to hire designers anywhere in the world right now. So you kind of have to think about what's the value proposition for a designer to come work at your company. And I think there's sort of two value props that ThoughtSpot poses. One is even though we're an enterprise software company, we believe design is a strategic differentiator for us in the marketplace. So design as a function is critical to the company's success. And I think that'll attract a certain type of designer. Also, like complicated hairball, design problems. Like, it's not the types of problems you often see in consumer software, which are more sort of emotive in nature. Like, this is more like productivity software, like really complicated productivity software. So again, there's a certain type of mind that's going to be attracted to that. So I think those are part of the value prop. So I believe we can attract two types of designers. We can attract people who are lead designers and really want to be able to own and understand the complex problem space, and are happy delivering software that is incredibly valuable to a small group of people, rather than trying to be attracted to software that's a little useful to a whole ton of people. So I kind of compare that, like at Pinterest and Apple, I worked on products that touched, arguably over 1 billion people. And that's kind of cool. How many people, get to do that? That's sort of a weird thing about our profession. The scale of people, the number of people that interact with our work is really unfathomable. And we never see them all together. So they just end up being, statistics in a log or something. When I was at Yahoo, I remember I told my team one time, I walked into the studio and I'm just like, I want to remind everybody in here that right this very minute, there's 40 million people on the Yahoo network.
Like, no fresh.
More people than, live in the state of California or on Yahoo right now. And it's really, it's really hard to get your arms around that mentally.
Yeah.
So anyways, there's people that are attracted to those big numbers. But then I had this other experience when I worked in Apple retail, and we were working on some of the systems that they use inside the stores. And you would, I'd go into the stores and I would see some of the specialists working with the handheld point of sale system, and they'd find out we were working on that. And they were so excited to meet us. Like they would come over and give us hugs, and they were so grateful because this was a tool that they use day in and day out. It was just, really mission critical to them. So that really taught me that you can work this, people say they want to have a big influence, they want to have a big impact. There's two variables in there. There's the number of people I'm touching, and then there's what impact I'm having on them. And so we look for people who are in a place where they're okay having a deep impact on a relatively smaller group of people than feeling like they have to have more of a surface level impact on a big, gigantic audience.
Right.
So that's how we think about getting lead designers. And then those lead designers will be supported by some junior designers. And in that case, we're trying to look for people that are relatively recently out of school, that really want to come to an environment where they're ready to learn. So I think the value prop to them would be, for the lead designers, the value prop is you can come here, you can own a space, and you can have an impact. And for the junior designers, it's you can come here and you're going to learn a lot. You're going to get exposed to world-class design talent, really complicated problems. You're not going to be a thought spot for the next 20 years probably, but you're going to walk out of here like with some really good design chops. And then the other piece that I kind of push internally is and this is true for the community and for all of everybody on the call, is I think we really have to broaden our horizons and think about reaching out to people that don't go to college. Because the reality is in the United States, only a third, about 33% of US adults have a college degree, which means that you're leaving behind 66% of the population we're not even talking to. And when we talk about diversity, and we mean that both, certainly demographically it's true, but I think also cognitively, there's a whole different in that 66% of people that don't go to college. And design is interesting, in all the fields kind of around design. It's interesting because it is a bona fide profession. Design is kind of a peer to law and medicine and architecture and engineering. And you can see it now in some of the salary numbers and actually in some of the influence they have in the country. But it's interesting because it's not a credentialed profession. You can literally work your way up from being like a junior production designer who got in the door because you were whiz at Photoshop when you were 19. And then you can be creative director, right? And there's people I can highlight in the community, like Alex Schleifer sitting up at Airbnb. Alex, has worked his way up this chain. And there's various people you can see in the community that some of them didn't even go to high school, and they're in incredibly impressive design roles now. So again, that's part of the message to how do you bring in more junior talent and help to evolve the field. And before I move on, I'll just say one other thing is my son's actually studying screenwriting at NYU. And so through him, I've gotten to see how Hollywood ingests new talent. And there is if you really look at what they're doing, and Hollywood is way far ahead of us in developing creative talent as opposed to the tech design community. And all the studios have major like emerging talent programs. And they talk a lot about emerging talent, and they're reaching out to students and trying to help them get into the field and get their new ideas, because Hollywood, they realize they need new ideas. And I look forward to the design community and tech getting to the point where we can stop focusing just on senior designers and just on unicorn talent. And we can say, no, we actually, our livelihood depends on bringing in younger people, because they're going to have a whole cluster of ideas that we are never going to have.
Yeah, agreed. It's interesting. I mean, I feel like a lot of the industries, it's good for us, if hopefully as an industry, to be learning from other industries that are actually learning from their mistakes as well. Because, you could say that the industry in Hollywood has been like pretty terrible about figuring out how to bring in emerging talent and like more diverse talent in general. Like they've been
those are two different things. I think they've done okay with bringing in emerging talent, but they haven't been bringing in diverse emerging talent. So they keep fishing in the same pool,
right?
Which is a problem.
Right. It's the meritocracy problem.
Right.
Yeah. So curious to dig into a little. Well, I think actually we have a question related.
There's been a couple of things on the chat.
One specifically about any thoughts on leveraging folks that may be facing a layoff situation to retrain in UX, from Catherine Webb Lynch.
Yeah. Look, I think there's lots of people that have minds that are well suited to design, and there's definitely programs for them to retrain. I think that's a pretty significant shift in career for a lot of people, but it's certainly something that can be done. I haven't seen a lot of candidates yet. I haven't seen a lot of candidates that came out of the boot camp programs, the shorter programs where they were really in a great space to come in and drop into a real design team. So I agree, Phil. Certainly we have to be able to retrain people. I just haven't seen those boot camp programs do that very well yet, but I suspect their curriculum's getting better. Part of the problem we have is we don't have enough people that have aged out of design, so to speak, to go in and teach. And so I think there's also just a sort of maturity of the industry problem of we need more people who have amassed good experience and can now go back and be teachers. So I think there's a little bit of a shortage there. I have seen a couple of situations where, once you're inside a bigger company, if the group gives off a vibe that they're looking for internal transfers, I have seen people move into design roles from other parts of the company and come in maybe as a producer, and then get into the studio and kind of get the environment and start to see what happens in the reviews. And then, over time, somebody says, well, why don't you help us out on this project? And again, you can see these sort of apprenticeship type situations emerge. I don't know of any companies that have successfully systematized those. I know a few companies are doing true internships, but apprenticeships are a little bit different thing. And I think that's a place that, we may try to push on that here at ThoughtSpot, but I think that's a place where certainly you could expect the larger companies, the Googles and the Facebooks and Airbnbs, to start thinking about how to build true apprenticeship programs.
Yeah, certainly. If they want to also like cast the net a bit wider, if people who are, because you often, oftentimes a lot of people have a change of heart even when they're soul searching in their life of the path that they might want to choose. And so it seems that, that's also pretty well aligned to design in general and how we think about, just end to end any kind of life cycle is like what are these kind of milestone moments where people themselves might be thinking about a kind of shift and how they might apply, and oftentimes at Frog, when I would hire, and even now, I would generally look for people who had very untraditional backgrounds and think about the problems we were trying to solve in very untraditional kinds of ways. So I think that like there are certain skills that people might think that would never apply to our world, but actually completely do.
Yeah. I had a real eye-opening experience back when I was at Apple, and at one point we had ingested a bunch of design leaders more from agency experiences, and so there was sort of this moment where there was 6 fairly senior people, and we didn't really know each other, and half of us had come, from sort of traditional corporate environments, and half from agencies, and I just decided to get everybody together, and like we'd sit in a conference room and get to know each other better. And so I wanted everybody to tell their bio and to like really spend like an hour telling their bio. So I kind of went first. And, when you tell your bio in an interview environment, it's a little bit opposing, and you're trying to set up your experience, and you typically try to get through it in a couple of minutes. But if you are in an environment where people give you space to really talk for an hour, it's pretty interesting what comes out. And of those 6 people, there was one guy that had toured with the Wu-Tang Clan. There was one guy that had been assistant to Jasper Johns. Somebody started out in urban planning, and as a leader, I'm listening to this, and I'm like, oh my God, like we're all refugees from some other career. Like nobody's got to be a designer, and then you start noticing really quickly that everybody's, has trouble with authority. Like almost everybody had this thread of not really doing that great in school, and sort of always, kind of always questioning their teachers and pushing back on authority and stuff. And you start to realize there were these common personality traits that people had sort of discovered design as a home for those personality traits. But often it takes them a really long time because, again, the field is just not that well known. And it's kind of funny, like you really want those misfits. And so you do have to cast the net really wide, and you have to be prepared to deal with a lot of cognitive diversity, and
Right. Yeah.
Profession.
Yeah, absolutely.
A couple other quick questions here. So on the information architecture piece, so Dan's got a great question here that Lou had highlighted as well. So, we don't hire dedicated information architects because we don't have enough, that's just not we're not that specialized yet because of scale. But whenever I'm doing portfolio reviews, I actually hammer on information architecture probably more than almost any other interviewer, because I believe information architecture is the central part of the system. It dictates the nouns and the verbs in the system. And so I tend to push people on mobile apps in particular. I push them a lot on how do they determine what the objects were in the tray. I think there's actual true politics involved. And I mean like a political philosophy statement embedded in the objects in the tray for a Facebook app or a Google app. And the example I always use was I wrote a master's thesis about zoos and sort of the evolution of zoos, because it's some level it's pretty crazy that we have a gorilla living next to the ocean in San Francisco. Like, what the heck's that about? And so I started using zoos as an example of information architecture, because just here in the Bay Area alone, you can find examples of zoos that are organized by taxonomy. You can find them that are organized by biozones, and you can find them that are organized by ecosystems. So just at the San Francisco Zoo alone, you'll see the bear grotto, which means nothing because it's bears from all over the world. It's like collecting bears like they're freaking postage stamps, right? It means nothing. It's a really weird representation of nature. And that whole idea was created by the Victorians when they were just sailing around, like picking stuff up off the ground. So that's a very political way of expressing nature in the information architecture of the zoo. There's other parts of the zoo that are like, oh, here's all the animals that live on the desert. Regardless of where they live in the world, they all live in deserts. So we're going to look for a commonality there. And then finally, there's like, complete habitats where here's the African savanna. We've got multiple species from that savanna. And that actually is the closest thing to actual nature. And those are essentially just three different information architectures of how you would classify animals. But there's a really, really divergent way of thinking about nature embedded in each of those. So I tend to push designers in our interviews, but our interaction designers, push them really hard and ask them questions about those types of issues in their designs. And over, I find that most companies, they just never sit and have real conversations about information architecture. Somewhere they just fall into it and there's a comp and people just kind of go along with it. I thought that was a significant issue in the design of Pinterest. It just never made sense to me what was in the tray. But it was something the company had fallen into without necessarily thinking, how does that tray represent the objects in the system? And how does that actually communicate to the user what they can do here? Super long answer about information architecture.
No, but it's great because I actually really I think that your bear grotto analogy is really relevant to the whole unicorn conversation, and it's like the design organization and how it's often thought about in organizations in general. Certainly is like, oh, well, they're the designers and we're just going to hire a product designer that's just going to solve all of these problems, and they're either level 1, 2, senior, whatever, but they can they're all living in the grotto together. They're not thinking about the fact there's a polar bear who needs to be in a cold environment versus whatever, I don't know. I don't know about bears.
Whenever I hear hiring man, whenever I walk into a new environment, I have had a lot of conversations with startups over the last few years trying to help them as they build out design teams. And they do sort of have this generic thing, oh, we just need to go get some designers. I'm like, well, there's a lot of different specialties, and they don't really know what that means. They don't even know how to distinguish between more of an interaction designer versus a visual designer, much less information architecture, content strategist, instructional designers, all these other roles that we think about. They just have no method for thinking about that. So I always kind of bring them back to, well, would you just hire a generic software engineer? Somebody that would understand everything from the database stack up to CSS? Of course you wouldn't. There's all these specialties in there. And it's the same thing with design. We all have different parts of the problem that we think about. And I try to describe it as people's minds are just suited to different parts of the problem. I think in words. I'm not that visual person, which is sort of weird when you think about being a designer, but I think in terms of words. So I'm much better suited to doing interaction design and information architecture. But I have people on my team that think in pictures. They clearly think in pictures. My son studying TV, he thinks in motion. And once you start getting the other people in the company to realize, oh yeah, of course, people think different ways, and so we need those different organic computers, if you will, to work on the problem holistically. And I do talk about, when I look out at a group of designers, obviously I see human beings, but I also see a bunch of organic computers, each with their own little tuned algorithm and they're going to be, they're going to be better suited to different kinds of problems. And so as a design leader, I think probably my biggest value add is being able to look at a design problem, and figure out which person's mind is probably best suited to that problem, both to the benefit of the problem and to the benefit of the person.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, I think about that stuff a ton. I think it's actually incredibly related to design operations as well. But there is a question that a lot of people seem to be super keen on getting some information from you on, is like, how are you thinking about actually hiring for these types of designers, or designers that you're looking for in general? There's this, it looks like we seem stuck in this whiteboard challenge in interviews.
Yeah.
What are some other ideas to dig into the design chops that people actually have in terms of what you're looking for?
Yeah, so, when we have candidates come in, and again, it's early days, so I haven't had that many candidates come in, but the way we're going to run these interviews is we'll have people come in for portfolio reviews, 2 to 3 projects, and when I'm in the review, I interrupt them a lot. And I try to set that up with the designer in advance. It's not a lecture, it's an interactive review of your work. Sometimes I'm purposely pushing on the design to see how they respond. I also want to make sure that they never blame anything on the client. Like that's a complete end to the whole process for me. If somebody says, well, I don't know, I never agreed, but that's what the client wanted, so that's what we did. It's like, no. You can disagree with the decision, but you have to be able to understand and explain to me the decision. So don't just blame it on circumstances.
Right.
And so and then we also watch how well do they manage the time. That turns out to be an interesting part of a portfolio review. I've given you 45 minutes. You say you're going to present 3 projects. We've got 7 minutes left, and you're still stuck on the first one. Because it turns out that a major quality of a successful designer in a company is their ability to manage the clock and present crisp decisions to executives. Right. So if somebody can't manage the clock, they're not going to be successful in these environments. It's not how it works. So
yeah,
the portfolio piece, and then we'll take a little break, let everybody kind of catch their breath. And then instead of doing the whiteboard session, because in the whiteboard session, what you're looking for a little bit is collaborative chemistry, which is going to be hard to ascertain in an interview environment because everybody's, they're just too heightened emotionally. But I think the real thing you're trying to understand is how they think about a product, like where their product thinking is, which doesn't necessarily come through when they're trying to represent their previous work. And so the thing that we're going to do is we're going to have designers critique in real time for us a product of their choosing. So it might be an app, it might be a website. They'll pull that up and they'll walk us through that work and kind of help us understand the things that they see in that design. Like, how do you think they arrived at certain decisions? What are the things in here that you think are a little off? What are the things that you think are interesting in here? And I think that will give us insight into their product thinking. I understand this is an exercise they're running at Facebook now, so people know, folks, hiring managers at Facebook, there might be some more actual data on how effective this is. As a designer myself, I've had to, I've done exercises like that. I've also done these real-time things where I drop in as a creative director and try to give a team feedback. And it's just really, it's not really fair to the candidate to expect them to just drop in and kind of instantly be part of the team. It's not a good first date.
No, especially considering, I think it was you actually who said this to me at when we were at Leading Design, we were talking about designers speaking more. It's like you're dealing with a whole bunch of introverts. You just throw them into an uncomfortable situation and be like, let's see how it works.
Yeah, exactly.
Definitely not.
The one that I really, really hate. So don't never do this. Never have somebody come in and try to critique or engage in a collaborative project around your own work. There's absolutely no way. I've been invited. It's like, well, tell us what you think of our product. It's like, no.
Yeah.
You guys know so much more about this product, and I am going to step on landmines left and right.
Yeah.
I just don't have any context, and there's no way I'm going to succeed at this. So, we did do some stuff, in other environments. I've tried stuff where we'd have people come in and we would make up a completely different design challenge outside of their knowledge base and our knowledge base. And maybe put an engineer and a product manager in the room and kind of do a 3-person collaboration. And maybe that's appropriate for a lead designer or design manager where you expect them to kind of be able to lead the conversation. But there's not an entry level or junior designer who's going to be able to manage successfully that kind of environment.
So, so in thinking about hiring and thinking about where you are specifically, and going back to what we were talking about earlier in the conversation, emerging talent, just access in general. What are your thoughts on building remote design teams or having people who are not, I think that it is like inherently much more inclusive, the more expansive you can be in your search. So what are your thoughts on that? And how do you, not only what are your thoughts on that, but how do you see leading through that? Not just, like bringing them on, going through the kind of like interview process, onboarding, making them feel part of the team, all of those things when, and there's two versions of it, right? There's like the one where there's an office and then there are people who work remotely. And then there's the ones like Envision where everybody's distributed, which are two very different models, but just curious to hear your
yeah. So, I've been saying for 6 years that the avant-garde of design management was working with remote teams. Like it is something that we just have to figure out as managers and as a community, as a profession. I haven't had that much experience doing it yet. It's one of probably the great growth opportunities for me as a leader. I'm starting to read the articles and like going back to my friend Scott Birkin and his book, My Year Without Pants, and trying to catch up on some John Maeda videos. You and I both have had a lot of interaction with the team at Envision, obviously. I do think the model of 100% remote is radically different from the model of a few people remote. But design in particular as a practice, there are many designers who are not going to make the lifestyle trade-offs necessary to come to the Bay Area. They would much rather make less money and be in Idaho or Boulder or something like that. So I think design in particular has to figure it out. I also, I think I kind of go against many of my product management colleagues in particular. I think it's better that people are remote because they can sit and really think about the work and try to solve the problem and then come back into an interaction with more comprehensive thoughts. Kind of notion that, we need all these drive-by, spontaneous interactions. That works for a certain type of mind. It works for a certain type of person. I'm not sure that that's a great interaction for most designers. Like when I'm sitting in meetings and people are like filling me up with all this stuff about, we need to do this, and you see like the introverted leaders, want to kind of engage in solving the problem in real time. And I tend to take this posture of I'm just sitting back and try to understand the problem more and taking notes about what the problem is. And then I want to go off and think about it and try to, and try to resolve it in some way and then come back and present something to them. It's just hard to, I don't know, there's a Sting quote that I like, which is democracy doesn't work in art. And it's just hard to, it's hard to create in real time like that.
Yeah.
A lot of times you just have to kind of sit and think about it. You have to go take a walk in the park and let it sit for a while. And, all you're going to get in those spontaneous interactions, you're just going to get people's knee-jerk immediate response. And there's a good chance that's not the best one. Personally, and I apologize to any product managers on the call, but I think that there's a bit of a political power play with product management where they like having instantaneous access to designers because they intuitively realize that that's the greatest power pressure point in the company. Because if you control the comps, you control the roadmap.
Right.
So it's very unsettling to have designers with a blank piece of paper being able to draw whatever, because that becomes the thing you talk about, right? James Madison controlled the Constitutional Convention because he got to Philadelphia early and he wrote the draft, and he spent the whole time debating his draft, right? He won. He won. He had all the he got to do the draft, and it's the same thing I used to tell my design team. Like when you come into these review meetings, you don't have to argue that much because you've already won. They're all just debating your ideas. Like all you have to do is listen and now make your idea better. And so I think PMs sometimes they intuitively want to get in there and kind of control the designers. So they want these open floor plans. They want the designers around. They want that kind of environment.
Well, yeah, it's like the commoditization of it too. It's just like
just draw the pictures for me and I'll tell you what's wrong. Yeah.
Exactly. Or exactly. Completely. I also think, but I mean, I don't know that that necessarily goes away with remote design either. There is still like, I think that there are the people who are faster and much more visual and can like, you know, they understand the way that that culture works, and that you need to deliver something that looks super shiny, and then you've been brought into the conversation. But I do think there is something really interesting. I feel particularly passionate about, like, you know, meeting people where they're at. And so like, you know, there's an incredible design community in Lagos, Nigeria. Like, how else would you have access to that unless you were able to hire remote designers? Like,
Right.
you know, like, unless, or you're there, one or the other, you know? And so like, there is a nice balance in having like a time difference. And so there is plenty of heads down time for people who are not on like US time zones, but also just that like ability to meet people where they are.
Yeah, I have to admit we're struggling with that a little bit here because we have a pretty significant presence in Bangalore. You know, the company was founded by some Indian nationals here in Silicon Valley who had previously founded a currently public company called Nutanix. And so we have, I think, a few hundred people in Bangalore, and you know, we're trying to hire designers there, but then what kind of creative oversight can you give them? And you know, managing a 13.5 hour time zone difference is a little.
Yeah, that's epic. Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
I don't think we've cracked that nut. But, you know, certainly having people in Hawaii or, you know, within a couple of hours. And there's certainly, as things mature and you're not having to rush as fast because you're not, you know, early stage startup, and you have a little bit more time in the system, then I think there's something about handing off the work and giving people time to respond and think about it. But like I said, this is all, you know, something I'm trying to figure out. And
Yeah.
I think it's something critical for us as a community to figure out. And
I think that Automatic definitely had an interesting model in that. You know, when I first started, I remember saying to John Maida, I was like, "What are my working hours?" And he was like, "I don't know. Like, you're a grown up, figure it out." And because it really is a distributed organization, that there were no working hours, and so it was very inclusive in that way. So if there was plenty of people in Australia, some people in Africa, like there was just this kind of cycle of being able to connect, and you had to just figure it out, you know, and be super time zone sensitive and
yeah,
just like empathetic to all of those things. It wasn't easy, but it
yeah.
was definitely part of the culture from the
Well, it's a
beginning.
really different mindset, you know, and as a new leader at a fairly senior level here in the company, like I'm struggling with, for lack of a better phrase, you know, how do I exert authority? Like, how do I make stuff happen around here? And it's not showing up and calling meetings. It's not, you know, which is how it worked at Apple. You know, it's how it works in many companies, many
Yeah.
traditional companies.
Yeah. I want to see you.
People exert power and influence and authority by calling meetings. And that's the pressure point where everything happens. But that's not what happens in a modern, agile, micro decisioning company. And so there's probably a lot to be learned from environments like Google, which are much more, you know, it's like a bunch of little things going around and it somehow works.
Micro community.
Yeah.
So I would, this is a design ops community.
Yeah, I noticed that.
Yeah, and I'm going to get in big trouble if we don't start talking a little bit about design operations. So would love to, you know, you hired Meredith Black, who a majority of us know and love. From Pinterest. So you've been thinking about design operations for a long time, probably before many other people were thinking about it. So I'm curious, having that experience and being where you are now and seeing the kind of discipline evolve, et cetera, like what are your thoughts about how design ops can contribute to everything we've been talking about over the, you know, the last 40 minutes? And yeah, like where you see potentially the future of that discipline fitting into just the future of all.
Yeah. So look, the first design ops person I hired was Jacqueline Phillips back at Apple in 2006 or something, 2008.
Oh wow, nice.
So I was, you know, and partly it's because I realized, you know, I'm rather ADD and I'm not doing well with all these details. Like there's just a lot of stuff that I, as a leader, couldn't deal with, and I needed help, not in an admin sense. I needed somebody to help manage the studio and manage the designers in a very meaningful way. And the way we got Jacqueline in and the way we got Meredith in, and some of the questions about the skepticism, like, look, we had the same thing at Pinterest. It's not like they were totally excited about bringing in somebody that they saw as overhead. But it was early days for me, so I had a little bit of capital as I came in, and I made the point that, you know, DesignOps is just this massive force multiplier on your design team. And I can either, you know, if we've got 10 designers, I can hire one more, and I've gotten 10% more capacity, or I can hire somebody in DesignOps, and it's probably going to increase the output of the company by at least 20, or the group by 25, 30%. So I can bring in that one other role, and it's just going to have this magnification effect on what's happening with designers. And so, yeah, I've been a big supporter of DesignOps. I love Jackie's talk that she gave at Leading Design in London. We're trying to hire a head of the director of DesignOps here, ThoughtSpot now. We've talked to a few people, and we're using her slide as to describe what the different functions would be inside DesignOps. And I think, you know, look, it's obviously gotten to be a critical function in all its different permutations, a critical function for how design organizations are going to scale. And the teams are having to scale as they're working on multiple platforms, the products, surface area of the products get bigger and bigger. And I think without that clarity, the designers kind of go off, you know, in weird ways. So there's something invaluable about having a function whose job is to kind of keep everybody aligned. Yeah, again, it just increases a lot of clarity for what the creative problems are, what the challenges are they're trying to solve.
Yeah, absolutely. You're preaching to the choir here.
Look, I'm a big fan. I actually haven't gotten a lot of blowback from management. I see those are some of the questions. You know, when I go, and there's just ways to position it about as a force multiplier, and they tend to understand that. And in both the Pinterest and the previous example at Apple, I purposely tried to choose somebody who could really pioneer the role. And I'm doing the same thing here. Like, we're going to hire somebody in as an individual contributor. It's like, look, you're going to pioneer the role. And we're going to start with this kind of producer function because that's the most obvious thing. And we just have to prove that out over the next 3 to 6 months. And then we're going to scale that into, you know, the hiring experience, the designer experience, production design, all these other functions, right? But we got to get that beachhead. And then also what you see, and we're seeing it here already, is that the company hasn't had much of a layer of project management, you know, people trying to keep everything running. There hasn't been that kind of communication role inside the company because it's mostly been a bunch of engineers building stuff. And so you're starting to see across the company this realization that we've hit this point where we can't scale anymore because it's gotten too chaotic. So now it makes sense to start to bring people in. They can focus on communications and alignment and things like that. And look, the designers are dying for this stuff. You know, I always tell people, like, you know, as a designer, you are hired to sit at your desk and work and do creative work. There's a lot of anything that you're doing that's not that, we need to figure out how to offload that into other functions and find people that are hired to do those things. Because it turns out these skills are really rare. And so, you know, if you have one of these superpower skills, we as a company need to figure out how to maximize the amount of time you're spending on that and try to reduce the other work. It's just called specialization of occupation. It's sort of a cornerstone of the modern economy. It's not some radical idea.
No, not at all. Not at all. I think the challenge for most people, and that, like, you know, you are in a position where, you know, where you can advocate for this role, and you're leading design, right? And you believe in it. And so that advocacy really needs to come from the top. Because most organizations, I think I would go on a limb to say a lot of the people on this call are experiencing the lack of advocacy and this need for proving value and this need for, like, you know, building the value of design operations or proving the value of design operations and metrics and this and that and the other thing. So I feel like, you know, what advice might you impart on those who don't necessarily have the buy-in? But I think just like design, many organizations know this is something they need, and they're like, oh, this is this thing, design operations too. Like, we have a design team now, and everybody's talking about design operations. We should get one of those. Then they get them, and they don't really know what to do with them. And it becomes like, in their mind, maybe it's overhead. But
yeah. Well, I think that's the trick, right? So you said, how do I communicate to you the value of design ops? That is probably a pretty hard lift. And you know, 10 years ago, we were trying to argue the the value of design. But then this thing called the iPhone happened, and suddenly everybody realized that design mattered because people were touching software thousands of times a day. And so, like design is in now. Like no, and I don't mean in a fashion sense. I mean, companies understand the value of design. They're very naive about what that actually means and what's involved. So there's a lot of education there, but they know they need it. And so you've got that toehold. And so the trick is perhaps not to sell design ops per se, but to paint a more complete picture of, if you really want to do design, this is what that entails. And here's all the systems you need around that to help. And one of those systems is called design ops. And here's how it functions in this larger picture of allowing you to do better design. It's true. Like you couldn't really, it'd be hard to like sell like, I don't know what the analogy would be, but there's functions inside companies that are part of the machinery that builds the final product. And so how do you leverage that? I don't know if I'm coming up with a great analogy here, which is,
no, I understand what you're saying.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, what would you, there's very now, but I imagine, I don't know if you have a good analogy to think about this kind of position in the past, but I often, and I think a lot of people do, like we can think very much in the now of like what design operations is, but in your mind, what do you think it could be?
Yeah, I'm not sure I've got a great answer to that. I like the culture of how a team works, I think is where I maybe see design operations. Like creative people, if you really want to focus on the creative problem, you have to reduce all the other stuff they have to think about. Like design is a method for making decisions. And we probably have all read stuff about decision fatigue and how some people wear the same clothes every day as a way to cutting down decision fatigue, right? Like designers need to drop into a ritualized system that allows them to just focus on the creative part and frees up the rest of their mind to focus just on the creative part. And I think design ops and design leadership can play the role of like defining what all those guardrails are around the system so that the designers are freed up to focus on the one thing. And I feel that a lot when I drop into new companies like ThoughtSpot, because they just don't have any of the frameworks around people. There's no rituals for this is how we do creative reviews. This is how we sit. This is how we induct a new project. These are the things that are going to happen at the beginning. These are the things going to happen at the end. There's no rituals. And without rituals, you can't get better, right? That's why tennis players always bounce the ball the same way. That's why dart throwers try to hold their arms the same way. Like in sports, like they realize that they're going to get better at a particular motion. They have to reduce the number of variables. And so without rituals and repeating the same thing, you just can't get better at it. And so I think, in the case of Meredith, like I really looked to her to give us guidance on how to develop those rituals. And I think she was uniquely able to do that because she wasn't invested in the creative outcome. Those of us that are really focused on the content of the work, we get kind of emotional and we get attached to certain things, and we're not in the right headspace to sort of manage and think about the interaction at a structural level. So I look to her and other people in design ops to kind of help us back up and think about, okay, what's the framework? What's the rituals that we're developing? And sort of, probably more than any other role in the group, they're the ones that are designing the machine that designs the designs. I'm sort of very attached to this.
Yeah.
If you're going to build a jet engine, right? You don't go build a jet engine by hand. You build machineries and processes that allow you to build a jet engine. To go back to the Apollo program, they didn't go to the moon once. They went to the moon. Well, they traveled to the moon 9 times. In the words of John Young, people say we faked going to the moon. Why would we fake going to the moon 9
times?
People went to the moon. They built a system. Those Saturn V rockets.
It worked.
Saturn V rockets are longer than a football field.
Right.
They set up, I think it's like 10 of them in 3 years. Like you can't build that stuff by hand. Like you have to build a whole system for that stuff.
Well, I think that I loved that when it was at this Buzz Pierce said leading design, because there's the question asked was what was his name? I'm looking at it about design ops potentially removing joy from the organic design process, and he responded with, "I don't think it's taking the joy out. It's helping people find where the joy is." And I really appreciated that, and it's very much aligned to what you're saying, is that it's like, let's just remove all the stuff so that we could focus on the things that the creative process, and all of the things that are stopping us from actually doing the things that we've been hired to do.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, designers and artists, the creative act works best in the context of constraints. Not limitations, but like, here's the box you need to play in. That's how stuff gets created. And we all maybe fantasize about Beethoven or Mozart or Haydn or some. I actually wrote a paper in college about the financial lives of those three composers. And a lot of what they were composing and the reason they composed certain things was because of the financial realities. Haydn he worked for a king. They paid him to produce stuff every week because he had to like put on symphonies, right? So he produced a lot of symphonies. Mozart had to go find rich people to like patronize and pay for something because they just want something written in their name. Beethoven, the main way he made money was he sold the music to sheet music producers who would then sell that to performers, and he didn't receive any copyright. It was like a one-time deal. So Beethoven ends up producing a ridiculous number of string quartets because string quartets could easily be played in public, right? So you could sell more sheet music of a string quartet than of a symphony. And there was actually a contract where he was going to write a 10th symphony, but they couldn't agree on the terms. He wanted some money up front, and he wanted some of the gate. Some of the first couple nights ticket receipts, and they were like, well, we can give you the ticket receipts, but we can't give you the upfront. He's like, well, forget it, I'm not going to write the symphony. If it wasn't for that, you'd have like Beethoven's 10th. They're operating within constraints. They're not just unfettered artists.
Right, right.
I mean, same thing, design is problem solving. And so part of the problem is the environment in which you're trying to work.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, because at the end of the day, we've got jobs to be done, right?
Yeah, I mean, thinking about it more, maybe a way to think about design ops is sort of culture design, right? Again, I'm going to design the culture for how this team operates, because it's the only way the team's going to get better. And I was talking to somebody about this actually just earlier today. When I came out of Apple, I had this belief that if you got the right people and enveloped them in the right process, you'd get products as a result. Because what I saw at Apple was a big machine for reliably producing products. And so at the base of that pyramid, I started with people. And that was the thing I went into Pinterest with. I was trying to hire the right people, and then we'd figure out the process, and then we get the right products. But when I started really looking at the history of mission control for Apollo, and I thought about how they set up the structure of mission control, and then I started hanging out with some of my Apple friends, and I came to realize that I had initially thought that Apple attracted a whole bunch of people, and you got them in Apple, you put them through the Apple machine, and they started to think like Apple people, right? So I mistakenly believed at the time that Apple focused on people first and created a process. What I later realized is that people had that mindset, and they had a shared mindset with Apple, and so they were attracted into Apple. And so Apple had developed a culture and a process that attracted people with a certain mindset. And so then I realized, like, here, our goal is probably more to produce, to create the culture and the process we want, and then we'll attract people that are interested in that. You see that played out at Disney as well. Again, Mission's a great example.
So many people, Frog was very similar.
IDEO is another great example.
IDEO, yeah.
So I think that's a key component when I'm talking to people who potentially run our design ops team. Mostly what I'm looking for is somebody who can help me, and can help me create that culture, and can drive a lot of that.
Yeah. So we are coming up at the top of the hour. I want to be mindful of everybody's time. I just have one fun last question to ask you before we wrap, sadly. What did you get your college degree in?
Oh.
Because this is fascinating.
Yeah, so I have 2 undergrad degrees from the University of Texas. One is in history, and the other one is in radio, television, film, which was basically film production. And so I didn't mean it at the time. I graduated college in 1985. I bought a Mac as a senior in college. Predates all this design stuff by a long ways. But it turns out that education was really useful in understanding storytelling, both in terms of history, like understanding how to weave together multiple narratives and points of view, and then filmmaking, like how to actually tell a story. So I didn't mean that, but that's how it worked out. And then later, when I had moved to the Bay Area, I started taking continuing studies classes at Stanford. They offer a Master's of Liberal Arts degree. And so it was through that Master's of Liberal Arts program at Stanford where I wrote the 2 papers I was mentioning.
Fantastic.
Yeah, liberal arts, it matters.
Liberal arts, it matters. On that note, thank you so much, Bob. This was amazing as always. I feel like I could talk to you forever. Really appreciate you joining at the end of the year. A great way to close out the decade.
Yes,
The DesignOps community.
Yeah.
Happy holidays to you. Happy holidays to everybody.
Yeah,
thanks everyone. Thank you, Bob, as another history major from the mid '80s. I'm so happy to know you. And Alison, thank you for moderating and setting this up. I think we're on for our next session on January 30th of the next decade. We're still nailing down plans there, but we will let you know if you are a member of this community. Again, please join it. Just go ahead. It's free to sign up. And we will also, if you're a member, we will email you tomorrow a copy or a link to the recording and the chat session from today. So thank you all. Have a wonderful holiday season. We'll see you next decade. Cheers.